The room was silent except for the low hum of conversation and the clink of champagne glasses. 400 people in black tie, seated at round tables draped in white linen, the grand ballroom of the Kensington Hotel glowing with soft amber light. I was wearing a midnight blue gown, my hair swept back, my hands folded in my lap. I was smiling. I had no reason not to. The annual Investor Gala was our victory lap, the celebration of a record-breaking fund close that I had spent 14 months engineering. Garrett stood at the podium, microphone in hand, his tuxedo perfectly tailored, his expression unreadable. "Before we celebrate tonight's milestone," he said, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd, "I need to make a personal announcement. Vivian, would you stand up, please?" I stood. I was still smiling. I assumed he was about to thank me publicly, perhaps acknowledge the work I'd done behind the scenes. It wouldn't have been his style, but perhaps tonight was different. Perhaps he'd finally learned. He hadn't. His voice turned cold, precise, almost clinical. "After 7 years, I've realized our marriage was a transaction, not a partnership. I'm filing for divorce, effective immediately. You're also removed from the executive committee. Security will escort you out after the event. I think we can all agree. It's time for fresh leadership." The room froze. 400 faces turned toward me. I could feel the weight of their stares, the sharp intake of breath, the whispered shock rippling outward like a stone dropped into still water. 2 tables away, Sloane Fitzpatrick, blonde, polished, 28 years old, smirked. Camera flashes burst from the back of the room. Someone coughed. No one moved. "My name is Vivian Ashford Mercer. I'm 34 years old. I've been Chief Strategy Officer of this firm for 9 years, married to Garrett for 7. I built the fund he just announced. I wrote the partnership agreements he doesn't understand. And I'm the reason every major investor in this room still answers our calls." I didn't cry. I didn't blink. I reached for my champagne glass, lifted it slowly, and took a single, deliberate sip. Then I sat back down. My face was unreadable because I had spent 7 years making it that way. He wanted me to break, to beg, to give him the satisfaction of watching me shatter in front of everyone who ever underestimated me. But the thing about building something from the inside is that you know exactly where the load-bearing walls are. And Garrett Holloway had just announced, in front of 400 witnesses, that he was about to knock them down. My phone buzzed silently in my clutch. I glanced down, keeping my expression neutral. A text from Marcus Chen, head of legal. "Don't leave, we need to talk. Clause 7.4. I didn't know what Clause 7.4 said, not precisely, but I knew Marcus Chen, and I knew he wouldn't have texted me in the middle of a gala unless it mattered. I looked up at Garrett, still standing at the podium, basking in the stunned silence he'd created. He thought he'd won. He thought this was his moment of triumph, the public execution of a wife who had outlived her usefulness. He had no idea what he'd just set in motion. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of whispered condolences and averted eyes. People I'd worked with for nearly a decade suddenly couldn't meet my gaze. Partners who had toasted my strategy presentations now shuffled past my table, as if proximity to me might be contagious. I sat through it all, my posture perfect, my expression composed. I didn't leave early. I didn't storm out. I simply waited until the event wound down, then excused myself with a polite nod to the colleagues who still had the courage to acknowledge me. I found Marcus in a private lounge off the main ballroom, a small room with leather chairs and dim lighting. He was already seated, a manila folder on the table in front of him, his expression somewhere between professional concern and barely suppressed urgency. "Sit down," he said. "We don't have much time." I sat. "What's Clause 7.4? Marcus opened the folder and slid a document across the table. It was a copy of the original partnership agreement, the one drafted when my father and Garrett's father founded the firm 32 years ago, the one I had helped revise when I joined the executive committee, the one Garrett had never bothered to read in full. "Clause 7.4, Marcus said, pointing to a highlighted paragraph, "ties your board seat to your equity stake, not to your marriage, not to your title. Your position on the executive committee is protected by your ownership interest in the firm. Garrett has no legal authority to remove you. I read the clause twice, then a third time. The language was clear, unambiguous, ironclad. My seat at the table wasn't a courtesy extended by my husband. It was a contractual right, earned through inheritance and confirmed through years of contribution. Garrett's announcement at the gala had been theater, nothing more. He doesn't know this, I said. No, Marcus agreed. He's never read past Section 3. I leaned back in my chair, processing. My father had been Theodore Ashford, the co-founder who built the firm's institutional relationships before his death 5 years ago. I joined the company at 25, worked my way up through analyst roles and strategy positions, and married Garrett 3 years later. I never took his last name professionally. I never needed to. The Ashford name meant something. It meant trust, competence, a track record that predated the Holloway family's involvement by a decade. What's our equity breakdown? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Marcus consulted his notes. The Holloway family holds 31%. You hold 38% through your father's trust. Eleanor Bradshaw holds 15. The remaining 16 is split among senior partners. I let that sink in. Garrett controlled the CEO title, but I controlled the largest single block of equity in the firm. He had the microphone. I had the votes. He didn't just humiliate me, I said slowly. He exposed himself. By making this public, he's triggered a governance crisis. The board will have to address the leadership structure. Marcus nodded. And you control enough votes to determine the outcome. I looked down at the partnership agreement, at my father's signature at the bottom of the page, faded but still legible. He had built this firm on handshakes and trust, on the belief that competence and integrity would always prevail over politics and ego. He had been wrong about a lot of things in his life. His faith in Garrett's father, his reluctance to modernize, his stubborn belief that family loyalty could substitute for talent. But he hadn't been wrong about this. He had protected me, even from the grave. There's something else, Marcus said, sliding another document across the table. The Holloway Family Trust has a morality clause. If Garrett is found to have engaged in conduct that damages the firm's reputation, he forfeits his shares to the general partnership pool. I looked up. How long has he been sleeping with Sloane Fitzpatrick? Marcus didn't answer immediately. His expression told me everything I needed to know. Long enough, he said finally. I stood, smoothing my gown, collecting my thoughts. The champagne buzz had faded, replaced by something sharper, colder. Not anger, not yet. Something more controlled, something that felt like clarity. Get me the documentation, I said. Everything. Hotel receipts, internal emails, performance reviews, anything that shows who Sloane is and how she got her position. Marcus nodded. I'll have it by tomorrow. I walked out of the lounge and back through the emptying ballroom. The caterers were clearing tables, stacking chairs, sweeping confetti from the floor. Garrett was gone, presumably celebrating his victory with Sloane somewhere private. The lights were coming up, harsh and unflattering, revealing the scuff marks on the dance floor and the stains on the tablecloths. He thought he was firing me. He didn't realize he was activating my succession rights. The penthouse was dark when I arrived. Garrett's things were where he'd left them. His cufflinks on the dresser, his reading glasses on the nightstand, a half-empty glass of scotch on the bar cart. Evidence of a life I'd shared for 7 years. Now suddenly foreign, like walking through a museum exhibit of someone else's marriage. I packed a single suitcase. I didn't take jewelry. Most of it had been gifts from him, and I had no interest in carrying reminders. I didn't take art or furniture or any of the expensive objects we'd accumulated together. I took my laptop, my files, and my father's old briefcase, the leather worn soft from decades of use, the initials TA still visible in faded gold. Standing alone in the bedroom, I allowed myself one private moment of grief. Not for the marriage. I had stopped grieving that years ago. Somewhere between the 3rd time he took credit for my work and the 5th time he introduced me as Garrett's wife, instead of by my title. The grief was for something else. For the years I'd spent shrinking myself to fit his ego. For the meetings where I'd bitten my tongue. the dinners where I'd smiled through his interruptions, the quiet accommodations I'd made because I believed it was the price of keeping the firm whole. I didn't marry him because I loved him. I married him because I thought it would protect my father's legacy. I thought merging the families would keep the firm stable, would honor everything my father had built. I thought Garrett would grow into his role, that his arrogance was just youth, that competence would eventually emerge if I just gave him enough time and support. I was wrong. Love wasn't the transaction. I was. I zipped my suitcase and walked toward the door. In the hallway, I passed the large mirror that had hung there since we moved in, a wedding gift from Garrett's mother. I caught my reflection, still in the midnight blue gown, hair coming loose, mascara slightly smudged. I was still wearing my wedding ring. I paused. The ring was platinum, understated, expensive. Garrett had chosen it without consulting me, because he assumed his taste was superior to mine. I looked at it for a long moment, remembering the day he'd slid it onto my finger, the promises we'd made, the future we'd imagined. Then I removed it, set it on the entryway table, and walked out. The boutique hotel was quiet, anonymous, exactly what I needed. I checked in under my maiden name, Ashford, and requested a corner room with a view of the city. The concierge didn't recognize me. No one here knew about the gala, the announcement, the humiliation. I was just another businesswoman traveling alone, needing a place to think. I slept for 3 hours, then woke at dawn and began making calls. The first was to Dominic Reeves, the managing partner of the Sovereign Wealth Fund that had anchored our latest raise, $400 million, committed on the strength of a relationship I'd spent 6 years building. Dominic was British, precise, and allergic to drama. He picked up on the second ring. "Vivian, I saw the news. I've already told my board. If you're out, we're reconsidering our position in the fund." I closed my eyes. $400 million. The largest single commitment in the firm's history. And it was tied to me, not to Garrett, not to the Holloway name, not to anything except the trust I'd built through years of competent, reliable, unglamorous work. "Dominic, I appreciate the call, and I appreciate your loyalty, but I need you to wait before making any decisions. The situation is more complicated than it appears." "How complicated?" "I can't discuss specifics yet, but I'm asking you, as a personal favor, to give me 5 days. Can you do that?" There was a long pause. 5 days. "But Vivian, if you're out, we're out. That's not negotiable." "I understand. I'll be in touch." I hung up and sat with that for a moment. Garrett thought he was removing me from the firm. He didn't realize I was the reason the capital stayed. The investors didn't trust the Holloway name. They trusted the Ashford track record. They trusted me. The second call was to Eleanor Bradshaw. Eleanor was 72 years old, a founding partner who had known my father since before I was born. She'd stepped back from day-to-day operations years ago, but she still held her equity stake and her board seat, and she still had the sharpest mind in any room she entered. "Vivian," she said when she answered, "I've been expecting your call." "You saw the gala." "I saw a spoiled child throw a tantrum in front of 400 people because his wife outperformed him for 7 consecutive years. Yes, I saw it." I almost smiled. "We need to talk, in person. My house, tomorrow afternoon, 3 o'clock. I'll be there." The third call was to my mother. Camille Ashford had never liked Garrett. She'd made that clear at the wedding, in her own subtle aristocratic way. But she'd supported my decision because she understood the calculation behind it. She answered on the first ring, her voice calm and warm. "Darling, are you safe?" "I'm fine, Mom. I'm at a hotel." "Good. Don't go back to that apartment. Don't take anything from him. And don't let anyone see you cry." "I won't. Your father would be proud of you, Vivian. Whatever happens next, remember that." I hung up and opened my laptop. The email inbox was already chaos. Messages from colleagues, board members, reporters, a few from friends who'd seen the footage. I ignored all of it and began drafting a memo. The subject line: Proposed Emergency Board Meeting, Governance Review. Garrett woke up the morning after the gala expecting victory. I know this because I know him. I know how his mind works, the rhythms of his self-congratulation, the way he always slept well after a performance he considered successful. He would have risen late, made himself an espresso, checked his phone expecting praise from allies and fear from rivals. What he found instead was chaos. 3 institutional investors had requested urgent calls. 2 board members had left voicemails asking pointed questions about the firm's governance structure. Marcus Chen had scheduled a mandatory compliance review for the following week. And somewhere in his inbox was a formal letter from Eleanor Bradshaw's attorney. I wasn't there to see his reaction, but I can imagine it. The confusion giving way to irritation. The irritation sharpening into defensiveness. He would have called his assistant, demanded explanations, blamed others for failing to manage the fallout. He would have told himself this was temporary, that people were overreacting, that the firm would settle down once they realized he was in control. He told Sloane the same thing, I'm sure. "They're just posturing," he probably said, pouring her coffee in the penthouse kitchen, pleased with himself for having claimed it as his own. Vivian was a figurehead. The real power is in the CEO seat. Sloane would have agreed. She was already measuring the penthouse for redecorating. What neither of them knew was that Theo Garrett, Garrett's younger brother, the COO, the perpetual second son, was quietly doing something he'd never done before. He was reading the partnership agreement. All of it. Theo had always lived in his brother's shadow. He was smarter than Garrett, more diligent, more self-aware, but he'd been born second, and in the Holloway family, that meant something. He'd accepted his role as the supporting player, the operational workhorse, the brother who made things run while Garrett took the credit. He resented it, but he'd never challenged it. Until now. I don't know exactly what Theo felt when he found Clause 7-4, or when he found the morality clause buried in the family trust. But I know what he did next. He texted Marcus Chen, "We need to talk." And I know what he didn't do. He didn't tell his brother. Meanwhile, Garrett received the formal letter from Eleanor Bradshaw's attorney. "Please be advised that Mrs. Bradshaw has invoked her right to call an emergency board meeting under Section 12.3 of the partnership agreement. Attendance is mandatory." The meeting was scheduled for 5 days later. 5 days for Garrett to continue believing he was in control. 5 days for him to make more mistakes. He had no idea what was coming. Eleanor Bradshaw's estate was exactly as I remembered it. A quiet, elegant house set back from the road, surrounded by old oak trees and meticulously maintained gardens. The interior was filled with dark wood furniture, Persian rugs, and photographs spanning 3 decades of the firm's history. In many of those photographs, my father stood beside Eleanor, both of them younger, sharper, building something they believed would outlast them. Eleanor met me in the sunroom, a glass-walled space overlooking the garden. She was dressed simply, her white hair pulled back, her eyes as keen as ever. A pot of tea sat on the table between us, untouched. "Sit down, Vivian. We have a lot to discuss." I sat. "Thank you for seeing me." "Don't thank me yet." She studied my face for a moment, then continued. "Your father would have burned that building down before he let Garrett run it into the ground. But you're smarter. You're going to let Garrett burn it down himself." "That's not my intention." "No? Then what is your intention?" I considered the question carefully. "To protect the firm, to protect the investors who trusted us with their capital, to protect the people who work there and deserve better leadership." Eleanor nodded slowly. "And Garrett?" "Garrett will protect or destroy himself. That's his choice." A thin smile crossed Eleanor's face. She reached into a folder beside her and produced a stack of documents. "I've been collecting these for months. I had hoped I wouldn't need them." I looked at the papers. Hotel receipts from a boutique property in the Hamptons, dated over the past 18 months. Internal emails between Garrett and the head of HR, discussing Sloane Fitzpatrick's hiring and rapid promotion. A performance review I had written 6 months ago, flagging concerns about Sloane's qualifications and recommending she be placed on a development plan. A review Garrett had overruled without explanation. "How did you get these?" I asked. "I have friends in the firm who remember your father. People who know what this company is supposed to stand for. I spread the documents across the table, reading them carefully. The hotel receipts were damning. Dates, room numbers, charges for champagne and room service. The emails were worse. Garrett had personally intervened to fast-track Sloane's hiring, bypassing the normal vetting process. He had promoted her twice in 18 months, over candidates with more experience and better performance reviews. The paper trail was clear, time-stamped, irrefutable. The morality clause in the Holloway family trust, Eleanor said, is enforceable if conduct unbecoming is proven and results in material harm to the firm. Garrett's public humiliation of you at the gala, combined with this affair and the questionable hiring decisions, may already meet that threshold. I set the papers down. I felt no satisfaction, only a deep, bone-tired exhaustion. I had spent 7 years protecting Garrett from himself, from his laziness and arrogance and entitlement. I had covered for his mistakes, redirected his blunders, smoothed over the damage he caused, and in return, he had made me invisible. I didn't want it to come to this, I said. Eleanor's expression softened slightly. No, but he did. He chose this. And now you have a choice. Protect him or protect the firm. I looked out at the garden, at the roses my father used to admire when he visited this house. I thought about all the years I'd spent being careful, being accommodating, being the responsible one. I thought about the night of the gala, standing in front of 400 people while my husband announced the end of my marriage and the end of my career, smirking as he did it. Maybe it's time to stop protecting him. What's the timeline? I asked. Eleanor smiled. The board meeting is in 5 days. The investors are already nervous. All we need is for Garrett to make one more mistake. She gathered the documents and slid them back into the folder. I suggest you spend those 5 days very carefully, Vivian. Watch, wait. Let him think he's winning. I took the folder and stood. Thank you, Eleanor, for everything. Don't thank me, she said again. Thank your father. He knew this day would come. He just hoped you'd be ready. For it. I returned to the firm the next morning, but not to my old office on the executive floor. Instead, I asked Marcus Chen for access to a small conference room in the legal wing, away from the main traffic, away from Garrett's line of sight. I needed to work quietly. Marcus had prepared a dossier of every deal Garrett had touched in the past year. Most of them were fine. Routine transactions, properly documented, adequately reviewed. But one stood out. A $180 million infrastructure deal in the Midwest that Garrett had fast-tracked over my explicit objections 6 months earlier. I remembered that deal. It was a toll road project with a promising return profile, but significant environmental risks. The due diligence had flagged incomplete compliance documentation, permits that hadn't been finalized, environmental impact assessments that were still pending. I had recommended we delay closing until the compliance gaps were resolved. Garrett had overruled me, called me overly cautious, and signed the commitment letter himself. At the time, I documented my objections in an internal memo, time-stamped and saved to the compliance file. I'd assumed it would never matter. I'd assumed someone else would clean up the mess, or that the compliance issues would resolve themselves, or that I was being paranoid. I'd moved on to other projects and tried to forget about it. Now, looking at the file, I understood what I had done. I had created a record. A clear, unambiguous record showing that the firm's chief strategy officer had raised concerns about regulatory compliance and that the CEO had dismissed those concerns and proceeded anyway. If the deal closed with the compliance gap intact, the firm would be exposed to regulatory penalties, reputational damage, and potential investor lawsuits. And Garrett's signature was on every document that mattered. I didn't need to sabotage him. I just needed to stop cleaning up after him. Marcus sat across from me, watching as I reviewed the file. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking that Garrett has scheduled a press conference to announce this deal's closing. 2 days from now, 2 days before the board meeting. He wants a victory lap. He wants to control the narrative. He wants to walk into that board meeting with proof that he's a successful leader, that the firm is thriving under his direction, that removing me was the right decision. Marcus nodded slowly. And instead? Instead, he's going to walk into a spotlight that exposes everything. I closed the file and slid it back across the table. Make sure the compliance documentation is complete and accessible. I want any auditor or board member who looks at this deal to see exactly what happened. You're not blocking the deal? No, I'm letting it close, exactly as Garrett wants. I met Marcus's eyes. Some lessons need to be learned in public. The press conference was held in the firm's main lobby, a grand space with marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows, designed to impress visiting investors and intimidate junior employees. A podium had been set up near the reception desk, flanked by the firm's logo and a display showing the project details. Cameras lined the back of the room. Reporters filled the front rows. It was exactly the kind of spectacle Garrett loved. He stood at the podium in his best charcoal suit, his hair freshly cut, his smile practiced and confident. Beside him stood Sloan Fitzpatrick, dressed in a fitted white blazer, positioned just close enough to suggest partnership without explicitly declaring it. The message was clear. This was the new leadership. This was the future of the firm. Thank you all for coming, Garrett began. Today, I'm proud to announce the closing of a $180 million infrastructure investment that will generate significant returns for our investors and create hundreds of jobs in the Midwest. This deal represents the kind of bold, decisive leadership that will define this firm's next chapter. He paused for effect, letting the cameras capture his satisfied expression. I also want to take this opportunity to address the changes happening within our leadership team. Transitions are never easy, but they're necessary for growth. I'm excited to announce that Sloan Fitzpatrick will be joining our executive team as Chief Client Officer, a new role focused on strengthening our investor relationships. A murmur ran through the room. Chief Client Officer. A title that hadn't existed yesterday, created specifically to legitimize a woman whose only qualification was her relationship with the CEO. I watched the live stream from my hotel room, my expression neutral, my coffee growing cold. A financial journalist raised her hand. Mr. Holloway, there have been reports of environmental compliance issues with this project. Can you comment on the regulatory status? Garrett waved the question away. That's been handled internally. Our team has reviewed the documentation thoroughly. There are no outstanding concerns. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. He didn't know that Marcus Chen was standing at the back of the room watching. He didn't know that the compliance file, the one with his signature overruling my objections, was already being prepared for the board's review. He didn't know that every word he said at this press conference would be replayed at the emergency meeting in 2 days. He ended the conference with a flourish, praising Sloan's fresh perspective and promising a new era of dynamic leadership. The cameras flashed, reporters scribbled notes. Sloan smiled demurely, already practicing for her new role. He just promoted his mistress on camera. He just took public credit for a deal with a compliance hole. And he did it 2 days before the board reviews his authority. That evening, Dominic Reeves sent a formal letter to the board. His fund was invoking its review clause citing concerns about governance and leadership stability. The letter was CC'd to every partner. The first domino had fallen. The cafe was small, quiet, the kind of place where serious conversations happened in low voices. I chose a table near the back, ordered a black coffee, and waited. Theo Garrett arrived 10 minutes late, looking uncomfortable. He was wearing a business casual outfit, blazer, no tie, which was unusual for him. Theo was normally precise about his appearance, as if dressing perfectly could compensate for being the second son. Today, he looked like a man who hadn't slept well. "Thank you for meeting me," he said as he sat down. "You requested this meeting. I'm curious why." Theo stared at his hands for a moment, then looked up. "I know what my brother did was wrong. The gala, the announcement, the way he treated you. It was wrong. But if you burn him, you burn the family name. You burn me." I took a sip of my coffee, giving myself time to choose my words. "I'm not trying to burn anyone, Theo. I'm trying to save the firm your family is supposed to care about. Your brother just put 400 million in investor capital at risk because he wanted to humiliate me at a party. That's not leadership, that's ego. Theo flinched, but he didn't argue. I know, I've always known. Then why didn't you say something? He laughed bitterly. Because I'm the younger brother. Because I've spent my whole life being told that Garrett was the leader and I was the support. Because every time I tried to challenge him, my father stepped in and told me to fall in line. He paused. My father is dead now, but the pattern isn't. I studied him carefully. Theo wasn't my enemy. He never had been. He was just trapped in a family dynamic that had been crushing him for decades. He resented Vivian for being more competent than his brother. He resented himself for not having the courage to say so. And now, with everything falling apart, he was finally facing the truth he'd been avoiding. You have a choice, I said quietly. You can stay silent and let the board decide Garrett's fate, or you can support a governance restructure and potentially step into a real leadership role. Earned, not inherited. Theo's eyes widened. You'd support that? I'm not interested in revenge, Theo. I'm interested in building something sustainable. Your brother isn't capable of that, but you might be. The question is whether you're willing to stop protecting him long enough to find out. He didn't answer immediately. His hands were shaking slightly. I could see him wrestling with decades of conditioning, with the fear of betraying his family, with the hope of finally being seen as something other than Garrett's shadow. I'll be at the board meeting, he said finally. And I won't lie for him. I nodded and stood, leaving money for the coffee. As I walked toward the door, Theo called after me. Vivian? I turned. I'm sorry for everything. Didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Sorry didn't undo 7 years of invisibility. But it was a start. Theo isn't my enemy. He's just been stuck in his brother's shadow so long, he forgot he could step out of it. The emergency board meeting convened at 9 o'clock in the morning, in the firm's main conference room on the 23rd floor. It was a formal space, designed for exactly this kind of confrontation. A long mahogany table, leather chair, floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of the city skyline. The room was equipped with recording devices, projection screens, and a secure video link for remote participants. Present in person, Garrett Holloway, CEO. Myself, Chief Strategy Officer. Eleanor Bradshaw, Founding Partner. Marcus Chen, Head of Legal. Theo Garrett, COO, 3 external board members representing institutional investors, gray-haired men in expensive suits, their expressions carefully neutral. Garrett entered last, as he always did when he wanted to project confidence. He was carrying a leather portfolio, presumably containing the presentation he'd prepared to defend his leadership. He took his seat at the head of the table, glanced around the room, and froze when he saw me. What is she doing here? He demanded. Eleanor Bradshaw answered before anyone else could. Mrs. Ashford Mercer is a member of this board, Garrett. She has every right to be here. I removed her from the executive committee. I announced it publicly. Marcus Chen opened a folder. Actually, Mr. Holloway, you don't have the authority to do that. He slid a document across the table. Clause 7.4 of the partnership agreement ties board positions to equity stakes, not to personal relationships or CEO discretion. Mrs. Ashford Mercer holds 38% of the firm's equity. Her seat on this board is contractually protected. Garrett stared at the document, his face reddening. That's not possible. I reviewed the agreement. You reviewed Section 3, Marcus said calmly. Clause 7.4 is in Section 9. The external board members shifted in their seats. One of them, Harold Winters, representing a major pension fund, leaned forward. Mr. Holloway, are you telling us you attempted to remove a board member without understanding the legal framework of your own partnership agreement? Garrett's mouth opened and closed. He had no answer. Eleanor Bradshaw spoke next, her voice crisp and authoritative. There's more. She produced another folder, the one she had shown me at her estate, and distributed copies around the table. The Holloway Family Trust includes a morality clause, Section 14.7. Any conduct by a family member that brings material reputational harm to the firm may result in forfeiture of equity to the general partnership pool. She laid out the evidence. The hotel receipts documenting Garrett's affair with Sloan Fitzpatrick. The email showing her unqualified hiring and rapid promotion. The performance review I had written, recommending she be placed on a development plan, a recommendation Garrett had overruled. The public announcement at the gala, humiliating his wife in front of 400 investors and journalists. The affair began 18 months ago, Eleanor continued. The subject of the affair was hired into a senior position for which she had no qualifications, promoted twice over more experienced candidates, and yesterday was publicly announced as Chief Client Officer, a role created specifically to legitimize her presence. She paused. All of this, combined with the public humiliation of a board member and major shareholder at our most important annual event, constitutes conduct unbecoming under the Trust's morality clause. Garrett's face had gone pale. This is ridiculous. This is a personal matter. It stopped being personal when you did it in public, I said quietly. The room fell silent. It was the first time I'd spoken since the meeting began. Garrett turned to look at me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Fear. Marcus Chen continued, his voice level and professional. There's also a compliance matter. He distributed copies of the infrastructure deal file, the $180 million investment Garrett had announced at his press conference. 6 months ago, Mrs. Ashford Mercer raised concerns about incomplete environmental documentation on this project. She recommended delaying the closing until the compliance gaps were addressed. He pointed to a highlighted section. Her memo is time-stamped and saved in the compliance file. Mr. Holloway overruled her objections and signed the commitment letter personally. Harold Winters leaned forward again. Are you saying this firm is exposed to regulatory penalties because the CEO ignored his CSO's compliance recommendations? That is correct, Marcus said. The environmental permits are still incomplete. If regulators review this transaction, which they likely will given the size and public attention, the firm could face significant fines and reputational damage. Garrett slammed his hand on the table. This is a setup. She's sabotaging me. The timestamps don't lie, Garrett, I said calmly. The memos are dated months before the gala. The signatures are all yours. Every decision that brought us here was made by you, documented by your own hand. He stared at me, his chest heaving, his face twisted with rage and confusion. He had spent 7 years believing I was invisible, unimportant, a decoration for his ambitions. He had never imagined I was keeping records. He had never considered that the foundation I'd built was designed to outlast him. He wanted me to beg, to cry, to fight. But the best revenge isn't noise, it's silence. It's watching someone realize, slowly, painfully, that they destroyed themselves. Eleanor Bradshaw cleared her throat. I move that Garrett Holloway be suspended as CEO of this firm, pending a full governance review. Theo Garrett spoke next, his voice steady. I second the motion. Harold Winters called for a vote. One by one, the board members raised their hands. The motion passed unanimously. Garrett sat frozen, his presentation unopened, his portfolio forgotten. He looked around the table as if searching for an ally, a defender, someone who would tell him this was all a mistake. No one met his eyes. Marcus Chen stood. Mr. Holloway, security will escort you to collect your personal belongings. Your access credentials will be deactivated by end of business today. Garrett rose slowly, mechanically. At the door, he paused and turned to look at me one last time. His expression was something between hatred and disbelief. I met his gaze without flinching. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply watched as the man who had tried to destroy me walked out of the room he had once believed he owned. The press release went out that afternoon. Leadership transition at Mercer Holloway Capital Partners. 4 paragraphs, carefully worded, professionally devastating. It thanked Garrett for his years of service, cited mutual agreement on the need for governance reform, and announced that a search committee would be formed to identify permanent leadership. His name appeared twice. Mine didn't appear at all. I preferred it that way. Sloan Fitzpatrick was terminated for cause before the end of the week. The official reason was conflict of interest and violation of hiring protocols. The unofficial reason was that no one wanted her anywhere near the building. She tried to reach Garrett for 2 days before realizing he wasn't answering her calls. She left the city a week later. I never saw her again. Dominic Reeves called me the morning after the board meeting. His fund was staying. The $400 million was secure. Other institutional investors followed his lead. They'd watched the situation carefully, and what they'd seen was a board that acted decisively to protect firm integrity. Confidence stabilized. The crisis passed. Theo Garrett was named interim COO with expanded responsibilities. He wasn't CEO. No one was ready to give a Holloway that title again. But he'd been given something more valuable, a chance to prove himself without his brother's shadow. He took it seriously. He worked harder than I'd ever seen him work. And when he passed me in the hallway 2 weeks later, he nodded respectfully and said, "Thank you." I didn't need his thanks, but I appreciated that he understood. I walked through the office for the first time since the gala, moving through the familiar corridors with a strange sense of detachment. Employees who had never acknowledged me before now nodded, smiled, stepped aside. Partners who had treated me like furniture suddenly wanted to discuss strategy. The same people who had averted their eyes on the night of my humiliation now couldn't stop making eye contact. I didn't gloat, I just walked. I didn't want applause. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted to stop being invisible in a company I helped build. And now, finally, they see me. Late that afternoon, Eleanor Bradshaw called me into her office. It was a small space. Eleanor had always preferred function over status, but the view was spectacular. "Sit down," she said. "The board wants to discuss permanent leadership." I sat. "They want you to consider the CEO role." I didn't respond immediately. The CEO role. The title Garrett had used as a weapon. The position he had treated as his birthright. It was being offered to me now. Not as a gift, but as recognition of what I had built and what I had survived. "I'll think about it," I said. Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. At this. "Take your time. The offer isn't going anywhere." The nominating committee met with me 3 days later, in the same conference room where Garrett had been removed. They made their case formally. The board's unanimous support, the investors' confidence, the need for stable leadership during transition. They offered compensation packages and authority structures and assurances of independence. I listened, I asked questions, I thanked them for their confidence, but I didn't accept. That evening, I drove to my mother's house. Camille Ashford lived in the same home where I'd grown up, a Georgian colonial set on 2 acres, filled with books and antiques and photographs of my father. The garden in the back was where he used to work on weekends, pruning roses and reviewing deal memos, his two great passions intertwined. We sat together on the bench he'd installed 30 years ago, looking out at the garden in the fading light. "Your father built this firm, so his family would never have to beg for power," Camille said. "He wanted you to have choices, Vivian. Real choices, not obligations dressed up as opportunities." I know. "Then why are you hesitating?" I considered the question. "Because I spent so long proving I was worthy of being seen. But now that they're finally looking, I'm not sure I want to perform for them anymore." Camille nodded slowly. "So don't perform. Create something on your terms." I returned to the office the next morning with an answer. I addressed the board in the same conference room, standing at the head of the table where Garrett had once presided. "I appreciate your confidence in offering me the CEO position," I said, "but I'm going to decline." Murmurs around the table, confused glances. "Instead, I'm proposing a new governance structure." I distributed the memo I'd prepared. "I will remain as executive chair with veto power over major deals and leadership appointments. The CEO position will be filled through an external search led by a professional recruiting firm. We will transition from a family dynasty model to institutional governance, with clear succession planning, independent oversight, and professional management." Harold Winters studied the memo. "You're giving up operational control." "I'm keeping strategic control," I corrected. The CEO title comes with daily responsibilities that don't interest me. Board oversight, investment approval, executive appointments, those interest me. I don't need to run the day to day. I need to ensure the long term direction is sound. Eleanor Bradshaw was the first to nod. I think this is wise. The discussion continued for an hour. Questions were asked, concerns were raised, details were negotiated. By the end, the board had accepted my proposal unanimously. The firm announced the new structure publicly the following week. The press coverage was positive. Legacy firm embraces modern governance. Analysts praised the move toward institutional standards. Investors expressed renewed confidence. Garrett's name was mentioned once, in a single paragraph near the end. I cleared out my old corner office and moved into a smaller space by choice. I didn't need the prestige symbols anymore. I had something better: control without performance. As I was leaving for the day, I passed a framed photograph in the lobby. It showed my father and Eleanor Bradshaw at the firm's founding, standing in front of a building that no longer existed, shaking hands over documents that had shaped the next 3 decades. They both looked impossibly young. I paused and touched the frame lightly. Then I walked out into the city, alone and at peace. The divorce proceedings were handled by lawyers who specialized in complex asset cases. My attorney was a former federal prosecutor named Diana Walsh, a woman I had quietly retained 6 months before the gala, when I first began to understand what might be coming. Diana was expensive, precise, and utterly unintimidated by Garrett's legal team. The prenuptial agreement I had signed 7 years earlier was the centerpiece of the case. Garrett had drafted it with his family's attorneys, assuming it protected Holloway interests. He had never considered that I might have read it more carefully than he had. The agreement clearly separated premarital assets. My equity stake, inherited from my father, held in a family trust, was explicitly excluded from any marital claims. Garrett's attempt to argue that he deserved half of my holdings was dismissed in the first preliminary hearing. The morality clause from the Holloway Family Trust added the final blow. With Garrett's conduct documented and the board's formal findings on record, the clause was triggered. He forfeited his shares to the general partnership pool. He left the marriage with a modest settlement and no stake in the firm his family had founded. Sloane Fitzpatrick, who had presumably expected to become the next Mrs. Holloway, disappeared from his life once the money did. I heard later that she moved to another city and found work at a smaller firm. I didn't follow up. She wasn't worth tracking. I received the final divorce papers by courier on a Thursday afternoon. I was in my new apartment, smaller than the penthouse, quieter, entirely mine, sitting by the window with a cup of tea. I signed the papers without ceremony, placed them back in the envelope, and returned them by messenger the same day. He thought ending our marriage would shatter me. He didn't realize the marriage was the only thing protecting him from me. My phone buzzed. A text from Eleanor. "Dinner this week? We should talk about the future." I smiled and typed my reply. "I'd like that." 6 months passed. The firm stabilized, then thrived. The compliance issue with the infrastructure deal was resolved through careful negotiation. Penalties were paid, procedures were corrected, and the project ultimately moved forward. Institutional investors increased their commitments. 2 new funds were launched. The external CEO search produced a strong candidate, a veteran executive named Sandra Chen, no relation to Marcus, who brought 2 decades of experience at major financial institutions. Theo Garrett grew into his role. He would never be brilliant, but he was competent and reliable, which was more than anyone had expected. He earned the respect of colleagues who had once dismissed him. He earned his own reputation, separate from his brother's. I attended board meetings quarterly. I advised on major deals when asked. I mentored 2 junior analysts who reminded me of myself at their age, sharp, ambitious, invisible to the people who should have been paying attention. I made sure they were seen. But I also traveled. I read books that had nothing to do with finance. I visited my mother every other week. I learned to cook. I started running in the mornings. I became a person who existed outside the office, outside the deals, outside the performance. I was no longer invisible, but I was no longer consumed. The charity gala was in October. not the firm's event, but one I had chosen to support, a foundation funding education programs in underserved communities. I wore a simple black dress and my father's old cufflinks, which I'd had converted into earrings years ago. They were small and elegant, barely noticeable unless you knew to look for them. I moved through the room easily, greeting people I knew, meeting people I didn't. I was recognized. Several guests mentioned the transition at the firm, the new governance structure, the articles that had been written, but I wasn't performing. I was just present. Near the end of the evening, I stepped out onto the terrace. The city spread out below, a grid of lights and shadows, endlessly busy, endlessly indifferent. The air was cool and clear. He wanted me to break, to beg, to make a scene. He wanted the satisfaction of watching me fall apart in front of everyone who ever underestimated me. But that's the thing about people who underestimate you. They never see the foundation you've been building. They only see the walls when it's too late. I thought about all the years I had spent being careful, being strategic, being the one who held everything together while someone else took the credit. I thought about the colleagues who had dismissed me, the meetings where I'd been interrupted, the deals I'd structured while Garrett took the applause. I thought about the night of the gala, standing alone in front of 400 people, watching my husband try to destroy me in public. He hadn't destroyed me. He had freed me. I wasn't waiting for anyone's approval anymore. I already had everything I needed. The city lights glittered below. Somewhere out there, Garrett was living whatever life he had managed to salvage. Sloan was rebuilding in obscurity. The firm was thriving under new leadership. My father's legacy was secure. And I was standing on a terrace in the autumn air, finally at peace. He ended our marriage in public to shatter me. But my response? It turned his world upside down. And mine? It finally became my own.